So Nathan, you on, so to work on the stage. Welcome, we really appreciate it. And it's just going to kick off with a little opening prayer for us and just bless us this morning.
God forgive me, I'm going to try and pray in English.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to ask you guys some questions during the talk. Feel free to answer in Afrikaans. I come from Belgie, I'm from Pakistan. So, they do.
When I thank you, we're going to welcome you here, Lord. And we know that you're always involved in our lives. We will thank you this morning for the privilege that we had to listen to Nathan's story. And that you will bless his lips and that his message to us will also strengthen us in our faith, Lord, and our daily lives. We also pray for our brothers that are not joining in today. Also bless them in their absence. Thank you, Father God.
Goedemorgen, good morning, goedemorgen, as we say. So, I like the dramatic intro. Let me actually do the same thing. So, Rian invited me to come speak here. I don't really know what kind of people generally come speak here, and I don't know if you get a lot of people from the university, but that's where I come from.
You are more popular than me. I 5 guys less, so
that's already good, yeah. So yeah, I'm a researcher. I'm a PhD student and a researcher for the Belgian University of Ghent. I don't know if anyone has heard of the city of Ghent. We've been there. It's very pretty. It's very medieval. And on this side, I work with UWC, which is not far from here. It's campus. So yeah, and I do kind of social and anthropological research in the Brooklyn area. So that's what I've come to talk about. Why I'm working there, what I'm doing there, and what I'm thinking about it. It is very much a work in progress. I've now been coming and going in Brooklyn for the last, I started going there at the beginning of last year. So that gives you a bit of an indication how long I've been there. But before I start telling you about all of that, I just want to ask some of you guys, and not the ones who know Brooklyn very well, but for the rest of you in the audience, what do you think, what pops in your mind when you hear Brooklyn, what reputation that place has got, not just now, but also maybe when you were growing up, when you were younger? I see there's some gentlemen of a certain age here. What kind of a place was Brooklyn and is Brooklyn today in your minds?
Before, as I didn't grow up there, there's similar places in South Africa which is called the Stars Dorp, which the government created these enclaves for poor whites that couldn't get jobs, and they were sort of all in there left on their own.
Yeah.
So it's really poor white.
Yeah.
I think I personal effort to get people going again. I'm not sure the real history.
Yeah, there's definitely, it is that. It is for a large part, that's Brooklyn. Anyone else?
I don't know, I'm not concerned, but I don't find like that dark now because of the poverty. In a place like that, where the poverty, you still like theft, all those kind of things.
Yeah.
Lower area.
No, I think that's absolutely right. That's kind of the reputation that Brooklyn has had for a long time. Actually, today, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of races in one area. I think they're different from other. I think they're
I called some surprise because I think 2 or 3 decades ago, like Toya, you were that, or you were that areas that served the schools, and at that stage it was all right to be in a lower class income group, and that was all right. And nobody they never knew about the area. I think things have changed, and they were both surprised that they couldn't counter the economic downfall. And that's when integration and all those things started, and everything that goes with that.
Yeah.
Not their world, but that they asked for that.
Yes.
But I didn't hear about this before I migrated.
Yeah.
So that's also maybe a different angle.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that because I didn't. I kind of found it by accident. But yeah, I think we're hearing a lot of things that are definitely, that's how people know Brooklyn. I think the father of my landlord lives overseas, but his father looks after the place, and he came in one day and I was talking to him, and he put it more crudely. I don't know how rude I can be in a church, but what he said, he said, oh, he's an English man, he must be somewhere close to his 70s. He said, oh, you're doing research in Brooklyn. Now, in our day, we never used to go there because it was the scum of the earth that lived there. And obviously he was talking about the days when it was still a white place, and he's a white man. So I thought that's quite interesting. I've never actually heard any white people talk about other white people in such a derogatory way.
I think there's also that comes from the English understanding.
Yeah, so I definitely think that that's an element in there, but it's definitely also a class difference that we observe there. Like I think he stays in observatory. Brooklyn is not far, yet it's a massive gap in terms of income difference in social class. So thanks everyone for that. Now I wanna show you guys a map. You know, academics, we like maps. This is a map that was drawn up in, what does it say? (1950). And it says here at the bottom, this thing is in the way. Can I drag this little bar?
You can click on that stop share on the red button.
Is it fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. So I'm going to show you 3 maps. This first one, it says, this map illustrates the group area proposals made to the Land Tenure Advising Board by the Planning and Referencing Committee appointed by the government. Obviously 1950, this is 2 years after the National Party has come to power. And this was kind of, in a very simple map, you see is very abstract, not much detail on there, but it is their vision of what, how Cape Town should look like after they've executed all their plans for kind of reshuffling communities and redrawing the map of Cape Town to be a completely segregated city. So you have all of this is now the white area, then they have almost like a buffer zone that's a colored area, and then there's like the black townships there. Obviously, this place was still farms back then. So that didn't really go according to plan fully. I'll show you as a reminder. I'm sure some of you remember it from the days when that was still the reality. What it turned into looked more like this. This is Cape Town in 1979. And this is all of the different group areas. Now, if we zoom in on, sorry, you guys in the northern suburbs have mostly disappeared off the map, but what we see here is it's all been nicely subdivided. Here's the only colored area together with District 6 and here, what's his name? Boca. Yeah, it's still marked here as a colored area. And then the purple spot is the only spot that's still officially a mixed race area at that point, which is Lower Woodstock and a little bit of Upper Woodstock here, which is kind of on the edge of Salt River, which is where I stay now. Otherwise, mixed areas have been completely phased out, not to say violently uprooted, and people have been sent to all corners of Cape Town, including the Cape Flats. There's a famous story that I think most of you will know about Cape Coloureds being taken from District 6 and forced to move all the way down here. And Brooklyn here, as we see, it's a white area. It was always a white area. It was planned to be a white area, just like these Cape Flats were planned to be colored areas. And round about that time also, the city of Cape Town started building lots of social housing. What did you call it? The gemeentedorp? Staatsdorp. As kind of, I think it's important here to, people call it a suburb, but really what distinguishes a suburb from a township? I mean, if you look at, when we think of townships, we think of shacks. We forget that a lot of the townships that were built originally in the 50s and 60s, they weren't shacks. They were, they had stone houses, brick houses. If you go to many colored townships, they look kind of exactly like what Brooklyn looks like. They're small houses, they're sort of square, block shaped. So in my opinion already, the time that Brooklyn was established and the time that other colored townships were established is kind of, you can see there's a lot of similarity there. Just the one was for whites and the other one was not for whites, was for coloreds. Now, I think we often hear this history in South Africa, but what we don't really realize is that it wasn't so easy back in the day in 1948, 1950, 51, 2, 3, 4, all throughout until the 60s, they were still doing this thing because they passed the Racial Classification Act. And the whole point was that for once and all, we should have neat documents showing who is white and who is not white, so that we can understand and the state can have clear policies benefiting kind of people who are on the white side of things, giving them access to social housing, giving them access to jobs at the post office, giving them access to jobs at the railways, and making sure that the rest wouldn't get those jobs or wouldn't get the same pay for the same jobs. Obviously, the difficult thing there was that it really wasn't so clear who was white and who was not. Because by the Dutch people arrived here in 1652. That's right, no? 1652, Jan Faribe. 1652 till 1952. How many centuries is that? It's about, what's it?
300 years.
300 years.
How many generations? Like 70 years ago.
So during all that time, and Cape Town is a port city. It was always a colonial port city. After the Dutch came the English, but the Dutch brought in people from Indonesia. The Dutch had their empire back then, so they brought in people from Indonesia, but they also went and they got slaves in Madagascar. They got slaves in Angola. They got slaves in the Congo. The Malayas, they come from, it's a bit confusing. They don't come from Malaysia, but they come from Indonesia. But also they brought in, because the Dutch had these trading posts in India, so they brought in Indian people already back in those days. Then they also enslaved Khoisan people who were all kind of on the farms put together in the same. There was a difference was made, but they were all together and they obviously had kids together. And the Dutch farmers would, also go there to the woman to satisfy their urges. So there was already a lot of mixing happening very early on. And actually there wasn't as much as a taboo on that as became later on. Because you must know the first people who came and stayed here, the first settlers, if you will, they were mostly people who worked for the Dutch East India Company. They were sailors, they were single men. there were no women here the first like 2 decades or something. So where did the new generations come from? It's from women who were in slavery. So there was already, sorry.
So I wanted to, some of the self work was real.
Yes.
So the faith and self, resumed today, we don't know, classical years ago, we don't know if we classified it.
Exactly.
It was never taught to us in school.
And Simon van der Stel himself was actually not even a Dutch guy. He was very much born into the Dutch East India Company, and his mother was from Indonesia, and his father was from some other place. He was born on a ship somewhere on a trading post. He grew up on the ships. He made his career on the ships. He never really set much foot in the Netherlands. So even Simon van der Stel himself today would have been a colored guy. And I'm sure no one was taught that back in the day. So I don't want to go too deep because I don't want to run out of time before we get to the Brooklyn part. But just suffice to say that there was a lot of what later became called racial mixing happening very early on in the Cape Colony. It's also important to know that they didn't call it racial mixing back then because the whole idea of different races didn't really exist yet. There was an idea that some people were Europeans and some people were indigenous peoples here, and some people came from somewhere else, and some people were Christians, and some people were Muslims, and some people were heathens. But there wasn't this idea of scientifically separate races. That was only something that came after. So when the English came in, it's another group that comes in. There's the rivalries with the Afrikaners or the Boers or the Dutch or whatever they call themselves at that stage in history. And they also tap into a whole other empire. I don't know if you've ever seen these maps. I should have had one of the British Empire, but at that point in the 1800s, it really stretched over the entire globe. So they brought in, you had people coming in from St. Helena, you had people coming in from the Americas, you had people coming in, when diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, that's when it really took off. And people started coming in from, not just from Europe, but from all corners of the English Empire. You had Australians coming here, you had Jewish people coming here, you had people really from everywhere, and they all came through Cape Town. So that's the point I want to make. Cape Town was an imperial port city that tapped into 2 different empires, the Dutch and the English. So you had a crazy mix of people. And it didn't stop once the English had taken over, because well into the 20th century, you had Greeks coming here, you had Portuguese coming here, you had Italians coming here. So it was always, you had Chinese and Japanese sailors coming here because it was on it was one of their ports of call on the, what happened here? It was one of their ports of call, you had these shipping trawlers that were fishing off the coast. So they were coming in to sell their fish here. So all throughout, you had a crazy mix of people, and they all ended up, most of them were working class people, That's always in any society. Most people are working class, and then you have a smaller group that's the elites. And most people, for a long time, Cape Town was a small city, so most of them ended up living in places like District 6 and Woodstock and your other working class areas. And so they all mixed, they all had kids together. It was a complete melting pot. And then the apartheid government comes in, they're sitting there high and dry in Pretoria, they're drawing up these maps, and they're drawing up these plans that you should have clear racial categories. And they are forcing that on a city that's as mixed and as diverse as Cape Town. And they are just hiring a lot of people, young, unschooled Afrikaners mostly, to go out and to classify people. And they gave them 0 guidelines. I think there's a lot of myths around this, but actually the apartheid definition of a white person was nothing else than someone who is generally accepted to be a white person. It was as vague as that. A black person was someone who is generally accepted to be a black person, and a colored person was someone who wasn't either of the 2 others. So it was as vague as that. There was no definitions based in blood. There was no definitions even really based in ancestry. because, and there was a debate played out in the South African Parliament in the late 1940s, where one of the conservative politicians said, we shouldn't include in this definition a rule about ancestry like they did in the United States, where there was this one drop rule, and if you had one black ancestor, like 7 generations back, you were classified as black. He said, no, we shouldn't do that, because who of you gentlemen here can know with absolute certainty that they do not have at least one black or Khoisan ancestor? And it's true. It's absolutely true. I know a lot of, especially in those days, but I'm sure today still a lot of English, but also a lot of Afrikaners, definitely. They like to believe that they're 100% Dutch, and you're lying to yourself. Let me tell you, your great grandfather had loads of children with different women that were his slaves or were his worked on his farm, and some of the kids he liked, and so they could be his legitimate children, and they inherited and they carried on the surnames. And why do you think there's colored Van Wyks and white Van Wyks and colored Du Toits and white Du Toits? Sure, part of that story is because the slaves often got the same surname as their masters, but also because a lot of the slaves were the kids of the master. So that's how that happened. And so what I'm saying is, you had unschooled state government employees who were going out and who were sort of just like that, saying, I think you look white, I'll put you on the list. I think you're not, maybe you've got a bit of a tan. I think, yeah, the gentleman back there actually raised his hand. Yeah.
Actually, the same as my ancestors. I could understand.
Hey, my man, you could. Yeah.
So there's a few talents involved in it.
Yes, Willem.
I think a lot of the things were, a lot of it, the government got the ideas of the Nazi regime.
They did.
The natural biology of a thing of the Hitler making an Aryan race with blue eyes.
Yeah, they were definitely inspired by the Nazi regime, but I think they were in a way more practically minded, in the sense that they realized they were living in a mixed society. You know, the Nazis had the benefit in their eyes, obviously, of living in a place that was mostly still 100% German. So it wasn't so far-fetched a vision to try to keep it that way. It was really about that, to try to keep it that way. Whereas what apartheid regime tried to do, by and large, was to conjure up, to invent a thing that wasn't there before, a clear group of white people. In some corners of the country, it was maybe more easy to say, you know, some of, like Mpumalanga, places where colonialism only reached much later, sort of well into the 19th century. There it was maybe clearer to say, like, those are Zulu people, those are the English. Sure, klar. But in places like Cape Town, again, it was very much sort of what do we call natte vingerwerk. So you're kind of just giving it a shot. And obviously, because these were working class people, nobody really cared if people were if people ended up in the wrong category. And whole families actually were torn apart. Because what I was going to say, it was about what you looked like. So there were, if you were darker, then you were maybe colored. If you were lighter, then you could maybe be lucky and be categorized as white. But appearance wasn't enough. Clearly, people were too much of a mix for appearance to be the only category that they could use to classify people. So other things came in. Language. What language did you speak? If you spoke Xhosa, then sure, you wouldn't be classified as white. But if you spoke Afrikaans, maybe you were white, but maybe not. Then it depends on how you speak, like what's your accent. But then also other things like what job did you do? If you had a good job, if you were maybe a clerk, if you could read and write, then that really increased your chances of being classified as white, even if you were more tanned, even if you maybe your hair was black and curly. You could still be lucky because maybe you spoke nicely, you were literate. And then finally, it was what other people said you were. If they're really unsure where they should put you, they went around and asked in the community, is this guy white or not? And if you were lucky and the community liked you, they would all say, yes, 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 he's white. If they weren't, if they didn't like you, you could end up on there. So and then different people that were doing this categorizing had different tricks. So I know everyone has heard about the pencil test. It wasn't an official test. The idea that they put a pencil in your hair, if it dropped out, you were colored. Oh no, if it dropped out, you were white, and if it stuck, you were colored or maybe black. Obviously, that wasn't an official guideline of the government. You know these pens with the little hook on, they stick. No, that wasn't an official guideline. That was literally something that some people that were doing the categorizing they came up with just on the cuff because they needed something. You know, other people had other tricks. Other people made people just strip down naked and look what color their penis was, because they were like, that bit sees no sunlight ever. So that's a reliable, because some people tan more easily. You have lots of Portuguese and Greeks who are as dark as colors. So that's just to paint you a picture of how brutal it was, how it was like they took a bulldozer or digger and they ripped through entire working class communities in Cape Town saying, you should go there, you should go there. And a lot of families a lot of colored families definitely remember this, when some of their uncles turned out to be white and some of their uncles turned out to be colored. And there's a lot of resentment around this, feeling like, why should we have fallen on this side of the line and not on the other? It was, in many cases, it was like tossing a coin. You could be lucky, you could be unlucky. So that's kind of the longer historical vision that I want to start off with. Being like, today we so easily talk about these different races, still today. Like the other day I was hearing on the radio, there was this whole debate going on if there should be a separate box where you should state your race for job applications, so for statistical purposes. We so easily talk about these races as if they're things that have been around for forever and if they're natural. And obviously that was exactly what the apartheid regime wanted, right? To have these things appear as natural, whereas actually they were highly artificial. And they were, from our point of view, very recent. I mean, 1950, I know lots of people who can remember that. That's not ancient history, that's living memory. So it was a recent thing. So that's where we get started with where my research begins. And this is all context. But my interest was in, I thought, apartheid ended in 1994. That's now almost 30 years ago. That's, apartheid lasted for 40 odd years. So that's almost, one decade short of that we've had democracy of how long apartheid was. So I thought that's a good amount of time. What actually has happened on that working class level in this city? And what has happened specifically to people who were back then were classified as whites, but remained that lower class of whites? What happened to them today? Did they manage to climb the ladder and make careers and buy nicer houses and move out to better suburbs? But surely not everyone. So my starting point was, let me go out and find whites who kind of stayed there at the bottom and who obviously after 1994 were reintegrated into a working class that they'd been nicely separated from. Because a lot of them had privileged job access to these jobs on the railways and jobs at the postal services, and they could have affordable housing in places like Esterplaat in Brooklyn. So a lot of them had a couple of good decades, but it was only that. It was only a couple of good decades. After that, what happened to them? And how did they fare now they were kind of on the same level as where colored people and Black people had been all this time? I like to call it sort of a reintegration of working class people into the Cape Townian working class. Whereas they'd been a bit privileged, not very privileged compared to other whites, but they'd been fairly privileged. But now they had to compete with everyone else. So that's how I found Brooklyn. Well, I went to look for Brooklyn because I arrived here in Cape Town. I knew Cape Town quite a bit, but how do you find that specific group of white people who stuck to the bottom and who never really managed to move up and who are maybe now starting to be integrated? And that's when I found this map. And this is really, I don't think anyone has ever looked at Cape Town this way. This is based on the census data from the 2011 census. So it's nearly 10 years old. And it shows you where different racial groups live. And so blue is Black people, colored is orange, green is Indian or Asian, and then pink is white. So that's how you see how much actually the old, what year was that? This was 2011. So I'm actually waiting, you know, they're doing the census now. I'm really keen to see what changed. But you see how stark the lines are, especially these lines. I don't know if you've ever been there in the Cape Flats where a colored area ends and a Black area begins. It's just one road. It's a narrow road. No one crosses that road. You can literally, it's different worlds. But you know, even here, I know lots of whites who live here, and then you've got that highway cutting through, and then there's Athlone. Yeah. It's just like, it's maybe 100 meters, not even 50 meters. So that's Cape Town still today. And that's, I think this map is a good reminder for anyone who has ever attempted to say now apartheid is a long time ago and we should really move on from this stuff, because it just shows you how much the whole city is still structured along the lines of that previous map that I showed you. But there are exceptions. And I thought, okay, let me look at this map differently. Let me not look for straight lines and see how segregated it still is, because everyone, I mean, we know it is, and that's a reality. But let's look at pockets of mixing. Let's look at pockets where people are living together, and then you have like Weinberg here, and then the CBD Woodstock is very mixed. And then there's here a bit of Maitland. Goodwood is pretty mixed, although it's majority Black now. And then there's Brooklyn here. And I knew some of these areas, I didn't know most of them. So I went on Google Maps, and you know, you can do street view, because if places are mixed these days, it can mean one of two things. Either it's a really rich area, and you have like a new Black and colored elite that's moved into these areas, or they are poor areas. And often they are previously poor white areas where Black and colored people have started moving into. And that was the case for Brooklyn. And Brooklyn is, even on this little map, you can see it's just, you can't even tell which is the majority. It's kind of split, 1/3 Black, 1/3 white, 1/3 colored. It's a perfect mix. What also struck me was that the whole of Brooklyn is equally mixed. It's not like you have a Black part of Brooklyn and then you have a colored part of Brooklyn and a white part. It's equally mixed. So I thought that's the place that I should go. So I took my bicycle and I rode to Brooklyn. And that's how I met Albert, and that's where the ball started rolling. And I started meeting people there, and for a year and a half now, that's where I've been going. And Brooklyn is actually really interesting because it's very self-contained. On the one side, you have the harbor and you have some industrial activity. On the bottom, you have Pardon Island, which is also industrial activity. On the other side, on the east, you have the Eistedplaat Air Force Base, so there's no one there. And at the top, you have Milnerton, but there's a railroad cutting through it, drawing a perfect line, which again, that's the dividing line, a class line. Above that line, people will be like, oh yeah, there's rich people living there. as the kids from Milton. And there's loads of stories of back in the day, people who grew up in Brooklyn, they will tell you that there were bioscopes in Brooklyn, and kids from Milton would come down to go to the bioscopes, and then the kids from Brooklyn didn't want these richer kids on their turf, so they would beat them up. And Brooklyn was, I mean, from all I can gather, it was a kind of a rough area. Maybe today it's rougher, like there's lots of people saying that, but back in the day still you had your white gangsters. They maybe weren't as hectic as today's gangsters, but then nowhere. I mean, District 6 also had gangsters, but everyone agrees that really gangsterism only got out of hand globally in Cape Town, kind of in the 2000s, and definitely around the point of 2008, when they linked up with international drug cartels. So that's only when it got really violent. So it's normal that people tell me that kind of in the 70s, the gangs in Brooklyn were softies, but there were still gangsters. And that's why my landlord's father says that it was a scum of the earth and he wouldn't go there because it was unsafe. Now, I've told you all this. I've found a lot of people in Brooklyn who fit perfectly this category, if you will, that I was looking for. Whites who never really managed to climb the ladder, or maybe they climbed a little bit and then they fell down again due to lots of different factors. Some because of addictions, alcohol. I mean, there's a lot of alcoholism in the colored community. There's also a lot of alcoholism in the white community, and it ruined some families. It really did. Some families who didn't have the networks to catch them in their fall, they ended up living in Brooklyn. But also people who maybe gambled away their fortune, people who just were unlucky and were struck with illness, people who were disabled and suddenly after 1994 were having to make do with the disability grant of 1,800 rand a month. Pensioners, lots of pensioners who, especially women who never worked during their life, and who were housewives and their husbands maybe died, or their husbands maybe were useless and they left them. And then they also had to make do with 1,800 rand a month, just like anyone else, just like every Gogo and every Oma, colored Oma that also has to make do with 1,800 rand. So it's like these state grants and things like that, they are great equalizers, actually. Great in the sense of effective equalizers, not in the sense of good equalizers. Because I don't want you to take away from this talk that I somehow take pleasure in the fact that people are now all living together at the bottom. I don't. I think segregation is a bad thing, but I also think poverty is a bad thing. So I would love for a community like Brooklyn to rise above its current conditions. But that being said, it is very interesting to me as an academic, but also I think to anyone in this city, to see how white people are forced to break out of their silos and are forced to live together with colored people and with black people, and kind of really, they have no option. And what you see happens when people have no option is that they kind of have to make do with their neighbors and with the people that are backyard dwellers together, like alongside them. You know, people who live in the hockey next door, people who live in the you have all sorts of really unusual, for Cape Town, unusual arrangements. You have colored house owners who have white tenants. Who's ever heard of that? People will say like, oh no, my landlord is rich. She's this old tanny who lives in Woodstock, and she's this colored tanny that by anyone else's standards wouldn't be considered rich, but you know, she has white tenants, and also alongside with Nigerian tenants, and they share the same bathrooms and the same kitchens also. So that makes for, and it's not at all harmonious. Like people fight a lot, and there's no lack of racism in that area. I think everyone has their own set of stereotypes that they whip out if you ask them about it. If you ask people, especially if you ask white people, but also colored people in Brooklyn, what they think of Brooklyn, they will give you a whole racist tirade about how the whole place has gone down because of all the black people that moved in there. But that's not what interests me. Because what interests me is that contradicts their actual conditions that they live in. Because they will tell you racist stuff, but then at the same time, they will have really good relations with his Congolese auntie and her 5 kids that lives in the room next door. And they will, I'm sure if you would press them on that, they would say like, no, but they're different. Or, people have a great capacity for holding these beliefs about general groups of people, but making exceptions for specific people, as long as they know them well enough. And they never really stop and ask themselves, what if I got to know them? Maybe they weren't so bad either. But anyway, yes.
I don't want to bring in what you're saying, but it's interesting. I think it's a concept in South African scene. Not only in our age, but also in other people's. It's like people want it to be like, in a sense that they want to be like this. Think of if they really wanted to mix with everyone else, maybe that would have changed. But it's like breaking through a barrier in the heat to see themselves, I'm just like everybody else. I can say whatever I want, and everybody accept it. So both from our concepts and both from the other people's concepts, that everybody is stuck in a certain concept of how it should be. And it is never changing themselves. Now they expect the government to change that, but government will never change that.
Yeah. So I see I only have 15 minutes left, so I want to maybe make a couple of points. I want to make it maybe clear what I want people to take away from this long winded story. But I think, why is it important that we bear in mind the fact that everyone comes from a mixed background, basically, and that in some parts of definitely working class communities, people are moving closer together again? Because I think I'm strongly convinced that where Brooklyn is at today is where Cape Town as a whole is heading down the line. I think there will only this kind of integration at the bottom, which is not the same as kind of the grand vision that the ANC departed on in 1994 of the Rainbow Nation. I think this is a very different kind of integration and a lot more grim. But the fact that it's grim doesn't mean there's no hope in it. I think there is, but it is a lot more grim, just to put it that way. I'm not a big proponent of, I'm not a big believer in the idea that a Rainbow Nation could be so easily achieved. But I think what it's taught me is definitely on one level is that if you force people to live the same kind of lives in the same kind of houses, in the same kind of quite shitty conditions, they will find ways, and they will be forced to get over their beliefs about each other easily. Or not easily, but it won't be in one day, but they will change their minds. And that is what people tell me in Brooklyn. So when colored people started moving into Brooklyn, that happened quite early already, actually. That happened in the late 70s, and then definitely in the 80s. Even though Brooklyn was still officially a white area, it became a gray area. And there were all sorts of colored people had all sorts of interesting legal tricks to acquire property in Brooklyn, even if it was against the law. One of the tricks was that you should set up a non-profit organization or a company together with a white partner. And as long as a white partner held 51% of the shares, they could acquire property in a white area. So you just found one friend who was white, they signed a piece of paper with you that they held 51% of the house. You gave them the money, the house was in the company's name, and you could go live there. And at that point, obviously, the apartheid police was too busy dealing with uprisings in townships to start policing suburban neighborhoods like Brooklyn. So they sort of left it. So I know some old tannies who that's when they moved to Brooklyn. And you know Katrina? Yeah. That's how Katrina ended up there.
Katrina is an example. She's a beautiful colored woman. She has
No, she actually married a white man. That's true. Yeah.
And her house and her backyard is, I mean, there's such a mix of people living and renting their white and black and but I need to go.
Okay,
So,
Stefan.
2 questions for you. One, I think my experience of Britain is that it's also become a real hotspot for foreigners. So mentioned Nigerian, Congolese, and maybe talk about the reason. Is it just that it's like close to the city and there's a lot of work, or something else that's kind of driven that? And the other question then is more around the work that we do there. Maybe to just share with the group your experience of that,
Yeah.
So I'm going to run.
All right, Stefan. So yeah, absolutely, that is true. That is something that I haven't touched on a lot because it hasn't been the main focus of my research. But Brooklyn is now, like a large part of its population are African foreign nationals, and again, they're often lumped together in one group, but they're actually a very diverse group of people. So you have large Nigerian and Congolese and Zimbabwean and Ghanaian and Angolan communities and Tanzanian and Malawian and all of them. And they, for many, there are several reasons why Brooklyn has become that hotspot. And I think some of them are the same reasons why other people want to live in Brooklyn, which is it's close to the CBD, it's close to town, it's close to a lot of things. So if you can choose, do I move into Kailicha or do I move here? It's rather move to Brooklyn. But also, obviously, we have had lots of xenophobic attacks in this country against African foreign nationals that have been really brutal and murderous and tragic. And a lot of the township areas are simply not safe for these people. And so that's why people rather stick together in a place like Brooklyn, where they don't have to fear as much because simply they outnumber any other group. So by this point, so no South African of any race in Brooklyn is going to try anything because they know they'll be in more trouble. So there is that, but also it's kind of with these communities, the way it works is people move to South Africa and often they have very little or nothing. And so they look for people of the same country. So Congolese people will look for Congolese networks. It's all about networks to kind of give them that first jump start, if you will. And so people will borrow them money, people will give them a roof to sleep under. So you have a lot of people moving into Brooklyn and then kind of making a bit of money and moving out of Brooklyn again. So it's the first port of call. It's really where people move through Brooklyn as one of the stages of trying to make a living in this country, trying to build themselves up. So you have a lot of people complaining about that. You have a lot of people, I think, unjustly blaming them for a lot of the things that are going wrong in Brooklyn. You have a lot of people blaming them for the drug epidemic that's definitely making a lot of casualties in Brooklyn. I think that's unfair, in my opinion, not just in my opinion. I think you can definitely say that's unfair because it's not foreigners that brought in the drugs were there before the foreigners. And I know that because I've met people who were dealing drugs in Brooklyn in the 1970s. I've met white people who were affiliated. I know this one Tani who I won't name, but her and her boyfriend in the 1970s, they got involved with the Americans gang and they set up the first drug house in Brooklyn in the early 70s. So the drugs have been there. The drugs are not foreign drugs either. Tuk, unga, all these things, mandrax, buttons, they're all pretty much home cooked. So what you rather see, I think, is that some foreigners come in and they look around like, what are the opportunities here? How can I have nothing. I have a family waiting back home to wait for me to send money there to support them. How can I do that as quickly as possible? And I actually spoke to one guy, Omar was his name, and he that's his story. He started off selling watches on the streets and selling belts, and he went and bought them in some Chinatown, and then he walked the streets and sold them. He walked through Epping and he sold them to workers in Epping. And after a couple of years of doing that, he realized I'm never going to get anywhere. I think at some point he saved up enough to buy old bakkie, and then he started doing flea markets and selling like trinkets at flea markets. And then he realized at some point that he was never going to make it, because these people often don't have work permits, so they're not even allowed to get real jobs. I know there's a lot of rumors going around about the foreigners taking all of the jobs. I can tell you it's not true, simply because they don't have work permits. And if they do get jobs, that's because you have unscrupulous bosses who hire them without contracts and who are underpaying them. And really, whose fault is that? I mean, these people are in a position where they can't afford to turn down any offer. And you just have predatory bosses who rather employ 2 Congolese men at the cost of 1 South African. But I think that's the state's, I mean, it's actually one of those things where the state is not giving out work permits because they want to deter immigrants, but the immigrants are coming anyway. And now it's creating a parallel labor market, an unofficial parallel labor market, which is undercutting the South African workers. If they were to give people work permits, then they could compete with South Africans, and then they would earn equal living, which I'm sure all foreigners would agree would be a good thing for them to earn more. But then at least they wouldn't be undercutting the South African workers, and you would have a better situation for everyone. But that's an aside. But yeah, the story about this one guy, and I think the story of many, is that at some point they live in Brooklyn, they see how many, like what the South Africans are doing, what these gangsters are doing, how much money they're making so quickly, and they say, hey, let me also sell some rocks. And this guy made a fortune during the World Cup selling cocaine to foreigners, and he managed to buy a building, and he's got a car wash now. He said he left that behind because he didn't need to do the cocaine trade anymore. It was too risky. He was also a Muslim, so he didn't really like drugs and other substances too much. So he said it was just a necessary step to try to establish myself here. And so it's one of those dynamics where I think a lot of people don't actually want to do this necessarily, but it's one of the only ways that they see to kind of get a solid foot on the ground here. So there's that, just to deal with the rumors about foreign drug dealers. I think that's good to know. Also, the 28s gangsters still hold a firm monopoly on the drug trade in Brooklyn, and you can rest assured that they will not let in any foreigners. So it's rumors, unfounded. Another thing is, so I told you one of the first people I met in Brooklyn was Albert, who I'm sure everyone knows by now. And he's been very, just a huge help, and I'm very indebted to him for introducing me to the neighborhood. Because if you're going to do the kind of work that I do, you're literally rocking up in a place where you don't know anyone. How do you get started? You need someone to take you around, to introduce you to different people, influential people in the community, who can then in their turn introduce you to more people. So that's what he's done for me. But obviously, he's shown me a lot of what him and the Roots Trust and the whole structure around them and the network around them has tried to do in the neighborhood. Everything from doing sort of everyday handing out food, which is very necessary, but it's also not enough, because you can give people food every day. I mean, there's this bit in the Bible, isn't there? I'm not even a Christian, but I do know this, that something about you can teach a man, you can give a man a fish, but you can also teach him to fish. So I think that's really goes at the heart of what. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Move there. You can just go in, or get a piece of land out of your platform, or you just tuck yourself there and just extend the place and get bigger.
So it's more interesting than that, because if you look at this, everyone will think, oh yeah, that's the squatter camp, right? You see a lot. You see lots of places like that everywhere in Cape Town. So people in the margins, people in parks, setting up shacks. But this is actually different. This is the Flay in Brooklyn. This is a nature reserve area. So you absolutely can't apply to buy or build anything there because it's illegal. But you have these houses. They're the houses on Kings Road, for everyone that knows Brooklyn. And one of them, there's a lady that lives there, a white lady. The same one that I said was one of the first drug dealers in Brooklyn and was kind of involved with the Americans gang. And she has set up a small squatter camp in her backyard. She's built these hockeys in the first place for her own children because she has 11. Yeah, she has been busy. She's lived a very full life. But then they sort of started to spill out from her backyard, and she's actually building up against the wall, the back wall of her property on the Flay, so on the nature reserve's land, without obviously. Now this is a white lady doing that and charging rent for those places. It's not her property, no. She's basically a white slumlord gangster.
Yeah.
Whoever thought that they would hear that? You get some of everything in Brooklyn. No one stops her. No, I think maybe because it's kind of stuck to her property, nobody's bothered. But also, I think a lot of people know that she is one phone call away from calling a whole bunch of armed gangsters, like combis of gangsters on them. So no one really, I think, wants to go there with her. Wants to take it to that point. Now again, but the thing is, it's more complicated than that, because what she'll tell you is that she's doing it to help people. And I mean, you can laugh at it, you can smirk at it, but what she says is, look, you cannot get a room in Brooklyn for less than 3,500 Rand. You have loads of people on pensions and on disability grants or without employment who can't work, who have like 1,800 Rand at their disposal. Where should they go? And in effect, this is one of the only places in Brooklyn where people can go and they can rent a hockey for like 1,500 Rand. Yeah, there is power. I think they share a tap. There's definitely no running water in the places, and I think they share a toilet as well, I guess. But people also just go and play and do their thing. So it's one of these, and I think it's ambivalent, and it's a lot of things are ambivalent in Brooklyn. It's like it's very easy to dismiss someone, just say it's, she's extorting people and she's asking 1,500 Rand or 2,000 Rand. It's a lot of money to be living in a shack. But at the same time, it is also true that the South African government and the Cape Townian government, or the Western Cape government and the Cape Town city, have failed miserably at providing social housing. You know that Eysterplaat side of Brooklyn where I talked about earlier, where they built all of those social housing for whites back in the day? They've sold it off. They've sold those houses off. And I'm sure the people who bought those houses, they tended to be long-time tenants of those houses. So I'm sure those people are happy with it. But basically what it means is that the city of Cape Town now, today, has less social housing than it did during apartheid. And that's part of that's a whole nother story, but that's part of the neoliberal reforms that took place in this country and in the Western Cape specifically under the DA. So they've been, I think they believe that if you have less social housing, you have less poor people, because they believe that giving people affordable access to houses actually makes them lazy because they don't need to go out and work. Obviously, we all know that's not true, because in Cape Town, more than anywhere else that I've been, there's such a huge disparity between people's income and what rent is and what housing prices are. For a small house, like one of these houses that used to be social housing back in the day, you can easily pay 9,000 up per month. But what is the average income that people are on? Jobs, even like jobs as clerks and as administrators and those kind of jobs, they start off at like 6, 7, 8. So you can't like, in the best possible scenario, you give your entire wage, your entire month's income to just pay your rent. So it is also true that people don't have a choice but to stay in this auntie's hockeys. And I still don't agree with her practices, but I do think she is well aware of that there's this fundamental problem and this fundamental injustice work in the housing market. And I don't think this is the way to tackle it, but hey, I can understand that there is an element of truth that if she doesn't have these hockeys there, where are these people going to go? They have to go to Joe Slovo Park and live in like a full-on like shack settlement.
It's a lot of people units, school in the neighborhood. That's been given by the city to low income.
Yeah.
The tremendous problems that got there from all sides. Spoken to people with they actually close that because it just doesn't work. So it's been given, it's provided very cheap, but there's a huge issues there. City's got a lot of problems there. They want to get rid of it
Because of the problems.
It's as we given about something. This area was created as a white area, but it developed into this sort of mixed situation.
So, yeah.
But the one in Woodstock, that's been sort of identified back then as a mixed area. Am I correct?
I think, yeah. So
but if you compare the conditions in both these areas, you say that it went better in Woodstock than in Rugby, where one was white and the other one was a coarse sort of mixed area.
So it's true. On the map, it is indicated as a mixed area. Woodstock was, but really, it wasn't by design. It was kind of it was merely still a mixed area in 1979 because the apartheid government never got around to segregating it. So they spent so much time trying to get rid of District 6 that they never got to the point where they started tackling Woodstock. So
the fact that it was left as a mixed area, that came up with the desired consequence or the desired result.
So it definitely, if the apartheid government had its way, Woodstock would have been all white, but it's true, it didn't, and it remained mixed, definitely lower Woodstock. Now, if you're asking me to compare today lower Woodstock to Brooklyn, I think it's very comparable in terms of the living conditions. Lower Woodstock is very poor. Houses are completely run down, just like they are in Brooklyn. And they have a lot of the same problems, gangsterism, with drugs, with so I think that's one of the remarkable things, is that here again, you see how much of a equalizer poverty and kind of being lower class is, that it doesn't really matter who lives in these areas, because lower Woodstock is a majority colored and a Muslim area. And Brooklyn is what it is. It's a mix. But people are confronted with the same problems of unemployment, of substance abuse, of kind of being forced to live in overcrowded places because rent is so high that the only way you can afford to have a place is if you share it.
So you say in Woodstock there's a natural sort of regrouping the Muslims and the international regrouping?
Look, lower Woodstock is, I find few white people to live there.
Is there national regrouping?
What do you mean by natural regrouping?
People start to all the, let's say, we also put that in addition to the Zimbabweans, that they would sort of regroup. So if they're left to themselves, that they regroup.
I think, I don't know about regrouping. I know that Lower Woodstock has been for as long as it's existed, has had a population of Muslims. And you can tell that by the very old mosques that are there, that are built in the early 20th century. So to a certain extent, that is something that happens where certain communities stick together because they do things together. So you,
culture, that's my fault.
it absolutely does play a part in you know, and in Brooklyn you have the same thing. You have a million churches in Brooklyn. You have your Nigerian churches, you have your Congolese churches, but then you also have mixed churches. Like I spoke to this one Congolese pastor who presides over a congregation that is a huge mix of people, and that's kind of that is what he tries to achieve, is to get a lot of different people to go to his church, including a handful of old white Tannies who are kind of very proud that they have a black pastor. It's very interesting. On another note, because in as much as I think that's a good point to make, in as much as you have people, a tendency with people to maybe seek people with their own culture and their own religion, even if they live in mixed areas, they will still frequent places where people like, so you have your bars where certain groups go. But as much as you have that tendency, you also have people choosing not to do that and going to mixed places. So you have mixed churches, you have mixed bars, you have all sorts of social hotspots where people do mix. So it's really you, and I think you have both at the same time. I mean, you have lots of people who maybe go praying in their Congolese church, but then they go drinking with their Nigerian drinking buddies, and then another day they'll you know, go to a market where there's some other group of people. So people are complicated and in surprising ways, and I think that's what I'm taught again and again. It's very easy from a distance to think, oh yeah, just people stick with their own and that's natural and that's how it goes. But then you go to a club in Brooklyn on a Sunday night, which I did last Sunday, because my white friend was celebrating her 70th birthday in a club that's run by a Ghanaian and a Zimbabwean couple. And there were, except for me and my one friend that I brought, there were 3 white people in that club. And all 3 were pensioners. It was my friend who was 70, and then there were 2 other men who actually go and get their food by Albert's. And they were there clubbing, white hair, they were nicely dressed up, and they were dancing there with the rest. And I thought I could laugh at this and I could sort of make fun of it, but I thought actually I have a huge amount of respect for this, because these are men that spent the majority of their life living under apartheid, that went through apartheid schooling and curricula that were made to internalize a lot of things about African people. Yet here they are having a great time. And they weren't alone. It was not like they were dancing on their own. No, they were surrounded by much younger black men. They were talking, they were having animated conversations. They were clearly having a good time, and clearly they knew a lot of these guys. And I thought this is interesting because one of the things that struck me is that one thing is that people internalize beliefs about others. Another thing is their conditions that they live in. And a lot of people in Brooklyn live in these old age homes where they are completely alone, and either they don't have family, or their family doesn't care about them or doesn't visit them, or lives in Joburg, so they never see them. And so they are lonely. And there is a lot of old lonely people in Brooklyn. I'll wrap it up after this note. There's a lot of old lonely people in Brooklyn. Cheers, Charles. And nobody really, so it's not special. No one's going to go out of their way to visit them or to. No one's ever going to give them attention even. If they walk around on the main road, no one's going to look around and sort of say, hey, maybe this person is lonely. But then, and everyone needs social interaction. Everyone needs for people to show interest in them, to care about them, to just have a conversation with them. And then they go in this club, and suddenly you have all these young guys who are like, look, that's interesting. This is old white grandpa walking in here. Let me go have a conversation with him. Let me go talk to him. Let me genuinely ask him, hey, how are you? why are you here? Like, not in a threatening way, in a welcoming way. Like, why are you here? Like, tell me your story. So that's what happens there. And I think these people find community in unlikely places. That's, I think, a core thing that I want people to take away. People find community, if they're forced to, they find community in unlikely places, places where you would never expect them. And they find things there that they never expected to find. They learn things about each other that they never expected to learn. So I think that's cool, and I have a lot of respect for that. Yes. Do I think I'm getting to that? Yeah. Those are two questions that I. So those are two questions that I definitely won't have time to answer in full. So look, you're gonna have to convince me to wake up at 5 o'clock again. You're gonna have to make some strong arguments. No, but let me just say now, some of you are still left here. This has been a huge pleasure, and I think it's been a good. It's always good when you spend a lot of time in your own head thinking about these things. It's always good to speak to people, and it forces you to put things more clearly. So thanks for hearing me out. I really appreciate that. Also, talking about people being put in unlikely places. This for me is like you are not a typical audience of mine, and I really appreciate that this audience is also a huge mix of social classes and age. Also, I mean, as I understand it, as from what Rihanna's told me, is that some of you are plumbers and workers, and some of you are more maybe university educated, have white collar jobs. So I do appreciate that. That's been really interesting. But yeah, so am I getting to the answers to the problems, to the world's problems? No. I think if anything, and maybe that's a bit discouraging, I'm just being shown every day that poverty is a very complicated thing. And it is absolutely true. I don't know who said it earlier, but it doesn't suffice to give people houses. It is not the sort of, there is no golden bullet solution to these problems. Because if you're going to give people houses, then there's still a lot of issues with substance abuse. If you're going to put everyone in rehab, then there's no point in putting everyone in rehab if you can't give them jobs afterwards, because they're going to fall back into the same thing. You can't give people jobs if they still have addiction problems and if they don't have a house to live in. So you see how these things all depend. They're all interlinked, and you kind of need to fight that battle on multiple fronts. And as an outsider and as someone who's quite left-leaning, let me put it that way, I think the DA that has run this city and this province for a long time now has been very lackluster in doing that, has been very lackluster in trying to tackle the complicated and the problem of poverty in the city for all poor groups, not just for poor whites, not just for coloreds, for everyone. So they've by and large actually done the same thing that the apartheid government used to do with poor people, which is to push them to the periphery of the city. They push them to Atlantis. They build like, they give them a plot of land, be like, build your shacks here. And then they said, okay, we dealt with them. We've dealt with their constitutional right to housing because we've given them, but nobody's going to stay in Atlantis because maybe their hustle is in the city. So they go back to the city and they go live in a backyard in Brooklyn because it's close to the city. Because transport is expensive. And so it's also rational. You know, it's people make calculations.
Don't they make use of information that you did?
Then on the Belgian front, yeah, absolutely. A lot of similarities can be drawn with Belgium and with other places where people from everywhere around the world are coming in and have made it their home for a long time. Again, since the 1950s and 60s, ever since the end of the Second World War in Belgium, Belgium went out of its way to recruit laborers in Morocco and in Turkey to rebuild after the war. In pretty much the same way that the apartheid government, even though they kind of tried to push the black people out of the cities, they went out of their way to go recruit people in Malawi to work in the mines in Johannesburg. So it's that idea. There's lots of similarities there. So a lot of there's a lot of similarities to be drawn. There's also in Brussels where I live, you have maybe not as extreme. You don't have that thing of backyard dwellers as much. But where I live, it's a very mixed neighborhood in Brussels, and you have people living in overcrowded apartments for pretty much the same reason that people do in Brooklyn, because the rents are too high and the wages are too low. And there's this disconnect between the two that is causing people to just huddle together with too many kids and too many families in spaces that are too small. So I think lessons are to be learned here that are also greater than Cape Town or South Africa. I think there's definitely truths out here that can be applied in many different places. But one of the frustrating things about doing social sciences, like what I'm doing, is that you're just learning that everything is very complicated at the end of the day. You know, people have simple answers for things. There are always people who are looking from the outside. They're not people who go talk to people, to actual people who live with these problems, and they should generally be distrusted, I think.
Nathan, I'm gonna have to stop you because I want to hand over something. from
Okay.
us.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll wrap it up here.
We're gonna, let's stand and you know, we're gonna, Kali's gonna just bless you. Thank you very much for really.
Yeah, this is from us. You can use that. I don't know, whatever you want to put in there, but you can drink from it. And yeah, remember us and
Thank you
thank you
very
for the
much.
good work.
Thank you so much.
There's a script, a free scripture. It says, I think it's in what's the spreker? Proverbs. It
Yeah.
says if you help the poor, you actually what's it? Mark 11. You make a loan to God.
Funny enough, I've got
Yeah,
that,
what's that scripture?
I've got that scripture
Enlighten me.
with me right now. I've actually sent it to my wife because it's
You make a loan to God when you help the poor. So
actually
you
sent
actually
this
put
to my
God in
wife
debt
earlier
to you.
It
Yeah.
says in Afrikaans, it says wie om oor 'n arm mens ontferm, hoe
Yeah, you can
it
just
cares
say.
about a poor person, gee 'n lening aan die Here, gives a
Leaning
loan
on
to
the
God,
yeah,
and God will fully reward him for that.
yeah.
So, you know, if you, it's Spreker 19 verse 7 and Proverbs 19 verse 17. Kali is gonna, let's just close our eyes for a second, and Kali, and you're gonna bless us and bless Nathan with his work going forward.
Hello, thank you very much for this morning.